poor, the blind and the lame. We don't tend to use that language these days, but everybody knows what it means. And so reincorporation is a kind of practice of abundance because it's built in the conviction that I talk about in detail in my book, God's Companions, that God gives us everything we need to be faithful. And it engages with that sense of anxiety that we don't have enough by saying, if we just look back in the history of the church and in the neglected part of the scriptures, we would find more than enough. And it is a wonderful experience.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Samuel Wells, and we'll be discussing his book, Improvisation, the Drama of Christian Ethics. I think it's probably helpful for me to explain how this situates into a podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts, because it's not overtly about biblical texts, although it is reliant on engagement with biblical texts, because the notion that narrative and one's understanding of their place in that narrative, I think that is in some way related to how people engage with biblical texts. I think this is also a pretty good way for Christians to maybe find some common ground with the Jewish tradition, because there does seem to be more self-awareness within Jewish communities around the idea that they are part of a story, part of a narrative, part of a people who are living out a story. I found this book in a bargain section, and so I don't think I expected that much from it. And when I finished it, it felt like it was lodged in my brain, and I have been thinking about it since then. I finished it at some point in March of 2007, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I hope that this conversation maybe gives you some insight or motivation that makes you think picking this book up would be helpful. And I don't know that you necessarily have to be an observant or confessing member of any particular religion to find some benefit to this. The idea that there are exercises in improvisation that could help you understand how to behave ethically, I think that could be important for a lot of people, but he certainly does put a stamp on this as a Christian thing. That is his intention. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Samuel Wells. Samuel Wells, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I was born in Canada. I came to the UK as a baby. I grew up in what we call the West Country, between Bath and Bristol, about 100 miles west of London. I went to Oxford University. I studied theology at Edinburgh University and did my PhD at Durham University in the northeast of England. And I served parishes in Newcastle, Cambridge, Norwich, Cambridge again, before going to North Carolina to be Dean of Duke University Chapel. And I came back to the UK in 2012 to become Vicar of St Martin in the Fields, which is where I am now.
And you did work on Stanley Hauerwas, correct?
Yeah, my PhD was subtitled Improvising on the Theological Ethics of Stanley Hauerwas. Its title was How the Church Performs Jesus' Story. I was drawn to Stanley Hauerwas because I was intrigued by the Barthian turn in modern theology, and I wanted to discover the intersection between theologians who basically believed the Christian package. People like Bultmann were still being read when I was at seminary, and yet were committed to the sort of social justice issues that I was very committed to growing up. The intersection of those places wasn't that common, and Stanley's work was one place where I found it represented. He seemed to be asking the same questions I was asking, but he had a whole bunch of answers that I hadn't previously found. I did my PhD between 1992 and 1995 on his work, and I guess I moved beyond his work at the end, as a PhD would usually do, and that's what took me into improvisation.
Your book that we're discussing today is Improvisation, the Drama of Christian Ethics. And as I was telling you before we started recording, I was reading it right now 17 years ago. And I know that because I read it around the time that my son was born and he just turned 17. But in my brain, Stanley Hauerwas' essay on Watership Down, which I interviewed him about, and this book have been intermingled for that whole time. And I was also reading a lot of N.T. Wright around that time, which kind of leads me into my first question about your book. Is there's a metaphor that goes through kind of as a common thread or as a beginning point in this book to get us into an understanding of improvisation. Do you mind breaking down what that metaphor is?
The metaphor of improvisation in the theatre, are you saying?
The 5-act play.
Oh, the 5-act play. I can talk about the 5-act play. Yes. Tom Wright talked about the 5-act play in a lecture he gave in the late 1980s. I can't remember the name of the lecture. And then it figured again in his thought. And I think he's moved on from the 5-act play in what I've heard him say subsequently. And I've heard him talk about 7 acts and all sorts of things, getting all a little bit over elaborate. But in the version that I transposed from Tom's work, and this isn't Tom's work, but obviously it's inspired by his work. I talk about 5 acts, and I give them different names sometimes, but I'll give them the names that I currently give them, which is basically creation, covenant, Christ, church, and consummation. That's to say, to break those down, creation I think is an easy one. I actually include the fall within that first act. That's a difference from Tom, who makes the fall a whole act of its own. I'll explain in a moment why I do that. Secondly, covenant, that's a word for the Old Testament, for Israel, for the people of God as understood, as called through Abraham, Moses, David, and so on. Christ, I imagine for listeners to this podcast won't need a lot of explanation, but the crucial thing about Christ is that Christ comes in Act 3. In other words, it's the fulcrum, it's the central act, it's the crucial part of the story. Crucial because crucial refers to the crux. The cross is a sort of intentional pun on words. It's the crux of the story. Act 5 is the consummation, is heaven, is the eschaton. And that leaves us in Act 4, between Act 1, 2, and 3, particularly 3, when all the important things have already happened, and Act 5, when everything that we faithfully try but fail to do is swept up by the Holy Spirit in what God completes on our behalf. There's a freedom about being in Act 4 because you don't have to make the important things happen because they've already happened and they can't be changed. But also you can experiment, you can enjoy, you can relax, because anything that you get wrong will be finally swept up. So that's the freedom of being in Act 4, which is the church. And the 2 mistakes you can make are to get the wrong act, to assume that everything we do now is decisive, and therefore to assume that we're actually in Act 3, for example, to assume that Christ has not yet come and to make the mistake of thinking we're in Act 2. Or you can think we're in a 1-act play, and that's more or less what I take secularism to be, is assuming we're in a 1-act play, and what if we don't get it all right in our lifetime, then there is utter cosmic failure. And of course, the freedom of becoming a Christian, of being baptized, is moving from a 1-act play to a 5-act play, to being in Act 4 of a 5-act play.
So you do address the exclusivity, because one of the things that you bring up early on in just explaining various approaches to ethics is the idea that some people are trying to do universal ethics, and you're saying I'm not doing universal ethics, right?
That relies on a distinction, and maybe I should run through what I mean by this distinction. I go into some detail about this initially in the improvisation book, but at greater length in the book that I wrote with Ben Quash, and the second edition also with Rebecca Eklund, called Introducing Christian Ethics, quite a memorable title. That was published, I think, in 2010. And we talk about 3 kinds of ethics there. We talk about universal ethics, which was the kind of ethics I was taught at seminary, usually known as deontological ethics or consequential ethics. That's to say, ethics that's about right and wrong, and ethics that's about the best possible outcome. I see them both as kinds of universal ethics because they're ethics for anybody. And I talk about subversive ethics, which is most in fashion at the moment, comes out of the liberation movement of the 1960s, both class, race, and gender. and now other things as well, which is about ethics for the excluded, ethics for the oppressed, and privileging the perspective of those who've been on the wrong side of history. And then what I call ecclesial ethics, which is ethics for the church. That ecclesial ethics, to say it's ecclesial ethics, isn't saying it doesn't seek to abide by and listen to the findings of subversive ethics. But it's not assuming it can speak for everybody, or this sort of common phrase that I was framed by all people of goodwill. It just says it has a modest proposition. So Stanley used to keep on his door a Mennonite poster that said a modest proposal for peace, that the Christians of the world agreed to stop killing one another. And that seems too modest to people when they first see it, and then they reflect on the last 2,000 years and think that would be a great start. And it reflects on the fact that if you are going to take an ethics of virtue, that's to say it's about the character of the person, not the quandary of the situation that really counts in ethics. It's about what they've learned to take for granted over decades rather than about what spontaneous insight they get in the moment of a crisis. If you take that view, then you have to pay strong attention to how the church forms the character of its disciples. And that's really what ecclesial ethics is all about. So improvisation is really a kind of ecclesial ethics, as I understand it, which is trying to show how Christian convictions work in terms of what kind of responses they make when you're not in a position to set the agenda. And that's what improvisation really assumes, is it takes away that sense that we're the chair of the meeting, or we're the king of the country, or the president of the nation, and that we get to set the agenda. Improvisation is very much about how we respond in situations we would never have chosen.
But there's a kind of purpose in the response, because one of the parts, oddly, that I'd forgotten about that stood out to me the most reading it recently is the idea of crisis, that your ethics should not be aimed toward being, I believe the way you worded it is, clever in a crisis. And as an American, where we like to go from crisis to crisis, I have to say that's something that's pretty challenging. How much of that is management and how much of that is just understanding?
So to take an example from quite recently, people might remember that that football team in Thailand of young boys who went on an expedition and somehow, for reasons I never fully understood, found themselves in a cave many feet below the surface of the earth and were stuck there and couldn't get out. And the whole world was captivated by their plight. It was about 5 years ago, I think. And then eventually what happened was a group of divers, or cave diver, I can't remember whether they're cave explorers, what the technical term is.
Is it
from
spelunkers?
Maybe, from Wales, were flown over to Thailand and succeeded in going down into the cave and getting them all out, including the coach, who was a bit older. And the whole world was mesmerized by this story. But of course, it happened not because people found a way of blowing up the cave and taking the lid off, not because the boys had a moment of inspiration and made some kind of human ladder or something. It happened because those cave divers had every second weekend gone down to caves in Wales and practiced. And they didn't know what they were practicing for. But they got better and better at the techniques of getting out of tight spots in underground caves, so that when a crisis arose that nobody could have possibly anticipated on the other side of the world, they were perfectly qualified to deal with it without it being a big deal to them. And that's just a perfect example. I guess another example has been made into a movie is of Chesley Sullenberger, who experienced a flock of geese flying into his aircraft engines after taking off from LaGuardia Airport about 15 years ago, and made an emergency landing in the Hudson River just beside Manhattan. And again, he'd practiced about 150 times in a cockpit detached from an aircraft as part of his pilot training. And so even though you and I would have been totally panic-stricken by losing one or two of our engines on a major transatlantic jet, he wasn't particularly fazed by it at all, because it was simply part of what he'd been trained to do. And the inspiration of those two stories is, wouldn't it be amazing if there was a community of people in the world who spent their lives training to do things that for everybody else in the world would seem like the crisis? And I guess the argument of the book is we already have a group of people like that. They're called the church.
So I guess it's about establishing the right expectations and intentions in how you act, because what you're describing there is a pretty traditional understanding of virtue. I know Sullenberger was Tom Wright's example in his, I think, an article or a lecture he gave on virtue, that he became skilled because drill and be prepared to do your job, to perform your function. So is it about expectations? Because I'm thinking of a conversation I had yesterday about prison abolition. And this scholar, Jeremy Williams, said, if people believe in a resurrected Jesus, why can't they believe that we can live in a world without prisons? And I thought that was I've been rolling that one over in my head for the last 24 hours.
I think, okay, so I don't know Jeremy, but it's an interesting idea. And prisons were actually invented by the church. As he probably said, it was the practice of sending monks to solitary confinement that created the notion of prisons in what used to be known as the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages. And of course, what prisons were an alternative to was either lumping off limbs or killing people. We have to start the prisons are an act of mercy rather than an act of cruelty in their inception. But obviously today, you'd like to think we're so sophisticated about things like artificial intelligence and flying rockets all over the universe that we should be able to do better than prisons, certainly better than the kind of incarceration system that exists in many parts of the United States. And anyhow, but if you were going to institute a system like that, you couldn't just do it from scratch. You would have to have an extensive program of forming people's imaginations. And I guess the best way to describe it is the best way to describe peacemaking in general. Peacemaking in general is extraordinarily vigilant. That's to say, if you're not going to have the luxury of resorting to armed conflict, then every time there's a minor disagreement, you have to have a very disciplined way of engaging it to defuse it. And if you think about a domestic relationship between spouses, for example, what often happens, and it's completely understandable, probably almost everybody does it, is that you overlook things and you choose not to mention things, and you don't want to make a fuss, and then something becomes more than an irritation. It becomes a huge thing, and it can blow up into all kinds of resentment, and probably should have been mentioned years ago when it first came up. Whether it's a laziness around the kitchen or whether it's an over-attention to other people's spouses or whatever it might be that's the cause of crossness, it needs dealing with straight away. So again, if you're going to abandon prisons, then you need to have forms of holding one another to account on what might be called micro levels, micro accounts, to borrow a phrase from microaggressions. The whole society needs to be practiced in this, so things don't get out of hand. And almost everybody who commits a major crime has committed a bunch of minor crimes that they've more or less got away with, and it just increases from there. There's a kind of whole pattern of account keeping in society, and that goes against not just secular norms, but Christian norms, because we like to think of ourselves as forgiving and of not holding grudges and not being judgmental and those kind of things. But to find forms of holding people to account that don't involve prison requires a whole change in culture. And so I think there is a virtue ethic, there is an ecclesial ethic lurking within there. What you can't do, I think, is just say it's non-custodial sentences for everybody, because then it becomes extremely difficult to impose appropriate forms of restraint and to avoid on perpetrators, and then avoid unaccountable acts of vengeance on the part of victims or their relatives. I guess that is quite a good illustration of just how demanding it is to be a people of virtue.
And when you bring up how prisons began, we're talking about Christendom there, or at least that environment where the church was considered to be society. And I feel like 2004, 2024, I'm in the US, you're in the UK. We're not talking about societies that consist of what we think of as the church. So it's whether it's Christians or Jews or whatever, someone with a religiously motivated ethic is contributing their point of view to society. So as it applies to say prisons, the bid there is we have between actual criminal activity or the poverty that creates it or mental illness that creates it. That's the bid to bring it back to the improvisation language. And then what are the options there? Do you see broadly speak? So there's, what is it, accepting the bid and over accepting?
Yeah, so I can certainly talk you through how improvisation, but we're talking about over accepting there. So to just explain, there are roughly four kind of dimensions to improvisation in the theatre, and over accepting is probably the most significant one that I'll explain now. When you're anything that an actor does on the stage in an improvisation session is called an offer. And when you are on the receiving end of an offer, there's roughly two things you can do. The first is to block it, which is to deny the premise of the offer. So if somebody says, bang, you're dead, and holds up two fingers and a thumb and makes it into a gun, to block it would be to say, no, bang, you're dead. I'm not to, in other words, to refuse to accept the offer, because the offer is actually a rather threatening offer of being killed. Because the actors sometimes find themselves unable to receive that offer because they don't know what to do other than fall down on the ground. The temptation is to block that offer. The second thing that you can normally do is to accept the offer. So in the case of bang, you're dead, you would fall down dead and you would just lie still. To take a more conventional offer, if you've been thrown a baseball, that's an offer. And if you catch it in your mitt, that's receiving an offer, that's accepting the offer. But because that's and I suppose when you do improvisation games, one of the games that is fun to play is where you lie down in a circle with your heads in the middle, like a kind of wagon wheel, and you do that in order to avoid the embarrassment of looking at people and to make the thing somewhat impersonal, because you can't always tell if there's half a dozen people who said what. But you more or less go around in the circle, and it's called word at a time, and you just say a word that continues the sentence from the person on your right. And to have all of your offers accepted, it can be quite an exhilarating experience, and it makes you realize just how much we block each other in conventional conversation and relationship. But obviously accepting all offers isn't a very satisfactory option if the offer is Putin invading Ukraine, shall we say, or Hamas killing all those people on October the 7th, 2023. Those are obviously threatening offers, and it's almost impossible to accept them. Hence the notion of over-accepting, which is obviously something in between blocking and accepting. What over-accepting is fitting an offer into a much larger story than the one making the offer realizes. So to me, still classic example of this is Princess Diana, and if people aren't of a generation where they saw the 1995 interview with Princess Diana, they might have seen it on the Netflix series The Crown, because that on The Crown they gave it 2 whole episodes, which was unbelievable and completely overkill. Anyway, during that famous interview, after she'd and Charles had split up, obviously before she died, a couple of years later, she was asked, will you ever be queen? And so if you think about that in terms of the 3 categories, to block the question would probably have been to say yes in that case, because blocking can sometimes mean yes rather than no. And because obviously it was very difficult to see in her circumstances how she could be queen, since she was getting divorced from the person who was going to be king. To have accepted would have been simply to say, no, I won't be queen, and to leave it at that. But she over-accepted, and she said, perhaps I'll be the queen of people's hearts. So by saying I'll be the queen of people's hearts, she was subtly, or not fantastically subtly, but we'll say subtly for now, subtly saying, being Queen of England is far beneath the likes of me. I have a much higher aspiration to capture the hearts of the whole world and be queen of everybody's hearts henceforward. And in some ways, she got what she wanted, though not in the way that she wanted it. So that's an example of over accepting. She placed herself in a global story about people's hearts rather than a national story about who their sovereign was. And that's a classic example of over accepting. And what I talk about in the book is the way that Jesus does this all the time, and that other characters in the Old Testament especially do this all the time, and it becomes a kind of a trope that you can see all the way through the Bible. And my guess is, if you read the book 17 years ago and you're still thinking about it, it's probably the kind of ways in which over accepting pops up all around the Bible and therefore could happen in many different circumstances today that captured your imagination. Just to give one more contemporary example, which I think is apposite, would be Colin Kaepernick taking the knee, because he was a black man who obviously understood his relationship to America as a country represented by the Stars and Stripes flag and the national anthem as being problematic, as many black people do, quite understandably. And rather, he could have blocked the flag and the anthem by maybe turning his back on the flag or something like that. He didn't do that. He could have accepted by simply putting his hand on his heart, as many Americans do when they hear the anthem and see the flag. But he didn't do that either. He actually took a knee. He knelt. So it didn't stop people criticizing him, but no one could sensibly criticize him for being disrespectful, because there couldn't be anything much more respectful than taking a knee. So he'd been more respectful than most people were towards the flag and the anthem. But by taking a knee as a kind of act of subjugation, he was implying that what was being expected of African Americans in relation to flag and the anthem was a kind of submission to an oppressive American story in which African Americans were always, and even today, being obliged to play supplementary and subservient roles in what's basically a white narrative. And he did that incredibly subtly with a gesture without saying anything. And I think the fury directed against him illustrates the power of over accepting, because actually that fury was almost impossible to articulate, because overtly what he'd done was be more reverent than the other players. But obviously subtly what he was saying was almost a kind of sarcasm, and over accepting can feel like a kind of sarcasm, but is much, much more powerful.
I think those examples are akin, and this is something that came up with Jeremy Williams yesterday, of there being imperial markers proclaiming Evangelion, and then there being the counter proclamation by Paul and others of Evangelion, of saying Caesar or his forces being outside of your city and saying, hey, good news, let us in and we won't kill you, as opposed to, hey, good news, this guy was killed like a criminal and you won't be follow this guy as opposed to that guy. That is, so there's a subversive nature to those stories. Have you thought much about, and I don't know if you're familiar with Watership Down, but have you thought much about how, because I've been thinking about that in conjunction with this book for so long, they tell each other stories and they attempt to live out those stories. And part of that is danger. Is that something that plays into your thinking in ethics too?
Oh, I think story is immensely significant. In that essay, 1981 essay, Story Form Community, that Stanley writes about Watership Down and is in Community of Character, which was one of the best known of his early books. What he's doing is he's taking his early interest in narrative and transitioning from a general sense of narrative to a particular sense of narrative, i.e. the Christian story, and realizing that some of what he'd already written about narrative in general is even more sharply focused when we're talking about the Christian narrative specifically. So that means obviously the Bible, but really understood as the 5-act play as I described it earlier on. I think it's hard to exaggerate how significant story is. And story, if you like, is exactly what deontological and consequential ethics don't have, because they assume that you can make decisions in a moment devoid of story. Certainly deontological ethics does. As Kant puts it, so the principle of your action should be a universal moral law. There's no story involved in that. And for consequential ethics, I guess there is a kind of story, but the story is usually very short. It's a story of what will happen tomorrow, what will turn out for the best, not a story of what will happen eschatologically in view of eternity. I've never been more aware of this than during the pandemic, and so particularly the early weeks of the pandemic, because Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, made a speech on March the 23rd, 2020, at 7:00 in the evening, telling us that we all had to stay at home, and thus began the first lockdown in the UK. But he promised during that speech that this would all be done by Easter, which was only a month or so later. He was in no position to make that promise. And he probably already knew when he made that promise that it couldn't be kept. And so for me, in some ways, that summed up his premiership, that he seemed to find it incredibly easy to make promises that he knew he wouldn't be able to keep. But leadership during the pandemic, more than at any other time, I experienced as a role of a storyteller. I felt my role as leading my own community was to find stories and analogies, but particularly stories, in which people could locate themselves. So I remember specifically trying to work out in the early weeks whether the abiding metaphor was Noah, by which, I'm still talking about the pandemic now, by which there would be a number of days of rain, followed by a number of days after the rain had stopped before anything happened, then a number of days in which the waters dried up, and then a number of days before we were able to return to normal life. Because that seemed like the abiding story, but then it, of course, with the second wave in the winter of 2020, 2021, we suddenly find ourselves in a position rather worse than the position we'd been in March 2020. And so the Noah story didn't really work. So was the story one of exile, by which we went away and were hidden away and then emerged from a kind of hibernation? Or was hibernation a different kind of a story? Or was it more like diaspora, where actually, as in some of the stories like the Book of Esther in the Old Testament, it's not set in Babylon and it's not set in Jerusalem, it's set in Persia, which is where Jews ended up after the exile had come to an end, but they decided not to go back to the Promised Land. So what was the story we were in? And I felt my job as a leader was precisely to identify what story we were in and then locate us as individuals, not necessarily all of us in the same place in the story, but locate everybody in the story to say, you're at this point in the story, you're at this point in the story. And I found it particularly helpful looking back on times doing godly play, the children's catechesis program devised by Jerome Berriman, because I remember particularly when he does the story of the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea, he invites the children to locate themselves, to pick up one of the wooden characters and say, are you in the middle of the Red Sea? Are you already crossed over and experiencing the beginnings of freedom, or are you still in slavery? And sometimes when I prepare families for baptism, I do a similar thing and ask them to locate themselves in the story. And I've often done that at Christmas time with a creche scene, to invite a congregation or a group of people or a home group to choose one character in the Christmas story that they particularly identify with. I can't say enough how important I think story is to ethics, to Christian ethics in particular, but to ethics in general.
I think in any of those narratives, if you're asking people to situate themselves in a story that is thoroughly one of uncertainty, it really does require resilience, which goes back to that being a positive, intentionally developed thing that may not be intended for the purpose that it ends up being used for. So going back to the divers, they were doing the right thing over and over again, not in preparation to get these boys out of the caves, but they ended up
Exactly.
using the skill to get them out of the caves. And whether it's Noah or diaspora, you don't know how long it's going to last. How do you get to the end when you don't know what the end is? Is that what you're saying?
So the best story that I found, and I do talk about it in the improvisation book, is John Irving's book, The Prayer for Owen Meany. Because in that book, the two boys spend hour upon hour of their upbringing practicing a particular basketball shot in which one becomes a kind of bridge for the other to be lifted up and obviously to score a basket. But at the very end of the novel, it turns out, and it's set during the Vietnam War, that a group of Vietnamese children are coming through an airport at a moment when a soldier on furlough goes crazy with what he's experienced and starts attacking them. And the main character, Owen Meany, is able to do this basketball maneuver and disarm the attacker at the cost of his own life. And it's the perfect illustration of what that Thai cave story illustrated also, and the Casey Sullenberger story illustrated. But I think the Owen Meany is the perfect one because the preparation was so intentional and so elaborate and so long-standing, and yet it's only at the end of the novel you discover something that the characters in the novel didn't previously know, which was that in some providential way he was being prepared for this defining moment of his life in which he saved dozens of other people's lives.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with this show, but a show that came out during COVID that seemed very necessary was Ted Lasso. And it, for me, was reminiscent of Andy Griffith. That's what it felt like, that there's conflict in the narrative somehow, because you have to have conflict to have a story, but it doesn't overwhelm. And the common thread throughout is the expectation of decency that this main character has of himself, of wanting to love people, of wanting the best for them, and failing sometimes, or failing at the thing that seems important but succeeding. And now I've watched it, I think three times through, and I love that we had that. I love that was put into the world and that it was so widely popular, because so often it's like true crime is way more popular than I think it should be. And that kind of bums me out, because I like to see someone who wants to do good overcoming conflict. That's me just going off on a tangent there, but that's, as you were speaking, that's what it made me think of, is, oh, we're talking about Ted Lasso, whether we mean to or not.
Before we finish on stories, I ought to mention the other of the two main tropes, if you like, motifs in theatrical improvisation. That's called reincorporation. So when you read a story to a child and it's about a bear and a moose, and actually you lose interest in the bear and it all becomes about the moose, and then you get to the end of the story when the moose has finally found its food and shelter and snuggled down by the fire, and the child won't be happy because the child will say, what happened to the bear? And children have an instinctive idea of how stories are shaped. And one thing that they won't let happen is for you to lose a character halfway through the story without reintroducing them. And if you read a Charles Dickens novel or a William Shakespeare comedy, what happens is all these people who were tossed aside halfway through come back in the last couple of chapters, and they usually marry each other. And that's because comedies have that habit of resolving some kind of irrational problem and therefore creating a sense of peace and harmony, which marriage is often a symbol, as their conclusion. And so reincorporation is what happens when you bring back into the story something that's been tossed aside and neglected. And one of the great writers in improvisation, Keith Johnston, says that improvisation is like a person walking backwards. So instead of walking forwards into the future, not knowing what we are to do or where we're to get our resources from, we walk backwards into the future, and our heritage provides us with everything we need to face whatever new situation might seem daunting if we were to face it the other way round. And my favourite reincorporation story is the story of St. Lawrence, who was a deacon in Rome during the Decian persecution in 251 AD, and was told by the consul to bring into the church the riches of the church. And so he was given 3 days, and 3 days later he brought in the poor, the blind, and the lame. And the proconsul said, "Where are the riches of the church?" And he said, "Here they are. The poor, the blind, and the lame are the riches of the church." I loved that story so much that I named my first child after the saint. And it's a wonderful reincorporation. So it's an over-accepting story as well, of course, but it's a reincorporation story because it's modeling the kingdom by bringing back into the story the people who've been excluded from or left out of the story. For the blind and the lame, we don't tend to use that language these days, but everybody knows what it means. And so reincorporation is a kind of practice of abundance because it's built in the conviction that I talk about in detail in my book, God's Companions, that God gives us everything we need to be faithful. And it engages with that sense of anxiety that we don't have enough by saying, if we just look back in the history of the church and in the neglected part of the scriptures, we would find more than enough. And it is a wonderful experience. I had this experience a few months ago, just before Christmas, reading Luke chapter 1, which surprisingly we don't read at Christmas very much, all the stuff about Zechariah and the temple, and found a verse that I'd never noticed before, which I found transformed my Christmas. And that's an example of reincorporation. I thought I knew the scriptures reasonably well, and I wasn't going to be surprised by too many of the things that were there, but I hadn't read that passage as closely as I might have done until just a few weeks before Christmas. So that's what reincorporation feels like. And that's what the kingdom of God feels like. It's a kind of an eschatological act by which you live God's future now. You anticipate the way things will be in heaven by the way you interact with people here. Reincorporation it's a classic move. If you listen to comedians, they'll do so much incorporation, and actually even humor around the family dinner table is often made up of bringing back into the story a neglected feature, and teasing people is often made up of reincorporation because you're often pointing out to them the inconsistency of whatever self-righteous positions they're taking up by pointing out that they did the opposite yesterday, which is a form of reincorporation. So that both over-accepting and reincorporation are narrative skills, but I think they're vital to the way the church thinks.
I'm blanking on the title right now, but I'm thinking about another book of yours about power, because I think
Power and Passion, maybe?
Yes. Okay. I thought that might be what it was, but I didn't want to guess. I figured I could get it straight from the horse's mouth, because at the center of a lot of this, I think if you look at, so there's status quo. So something like prisons, status quo, and how do you respond to the status quo? And you can choose to respond to the status quo imaginatively, or you could choose to respond to the status quo by leaving it in place. And that may or may not be aligned with power that benefits you. But I think what might be missed there, and this, if I'm wrong on what I took to be the thesis of that book, and it's been 15 years since I read that one, was that people miss where they already have power sometimes, and they could be acting and are not. And so we could use prisons, we could use feeding the hungry, we could use any number of examples for this, but not acknowledging that you have the power. So on something like criminalization and criminal justice, these are artifacts. They're things that people made, and that you can have a contribution to making them different or better, or at least not as bad. And I feel like that is an undercurrent in this conversation. Am I off base? If I'm off base, please tell me.
No, I suppose a classic story about this, and I don't want people to take this too literally or be offended by it, but I can't stop them if they want to. I remember a friend of mine was halfway up a ladder painting a window frame of his apartment, and because his apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there'd been a number of small burglaries from the properties nearby, and his apartment was behind a 6-foot wall, And on the other side of the wall was a bus stop that was quite busy because it was in London and a lot of people used the buses. And he looked down and he saw a 10-year-old boy trying to break into the apartment on the ground floor. And he suddenly put two and two together and realized that the source of all of these burglaries was probably this 10-year-old boy. So he shimmied down the ladder in that kind of way in the movies where people don't use the rungs, they just do the bit with their 2 feet and went straight down the ladder. And he cornered the boy. And then he thought, what do I do now? And the boy shouted out, there's a man and he's trying to grab me willy. And because the boy knew that on the other side of the wall was a bus stop and there were likely to be people there. And of course, my friend was completely stuck then. There was nothing he could do. He was a professional person. He had a reputation to defend. He hadn't been anywhere near the boy. But the boy had come up with a form of power that he was absolutely powerless again. And all he could do was tell the boy to go away and run off, which is exactly what happened. I tell that story not because I recommend that kind of misuse of the truth, but because it shows that a 10-year-old boy who's completely guilty and is completely defenseless and has been completely cornered still has power. And often, as you've just said, people don't realize the power they have. I'm not saying that subverting the truth is always the best way to use that, but the point is that often they do have power. They just don't realize the power they have because they assume the only kind of power is force and the bludgeon. But that's far from the case. There are all kinds of different forms of power. And the great movements of history have come about when people have realized that they have access to a kind of power that the dominant forces in society are defenseless against. And that's where dynamism comes from. And of course, Christianity at its beginning was exactly that kind of power. It appealed to women, it appealed to slaves because they were pawns in the game of the master of the household who had access to the bodies of anybody who lived in a Roman household. And all the women in it and all the slaves in it were completely subject to his merciless advances at times. And so they gravitated towards Christianity and suddenly found a kind of power that transformed their lives. Of course, they were drawn to Christianity, but I think Christianity should still be made up of that kind of power. It's a profoundly subversive force that unseats conventional kinds of power, and people who become Christians have access to that kind of power, but often they don't realize it.
I think that little boy is a good example of what you're not saying, because he was quite clever in a crisis. And
He was certainly, he improvised.
So because we're coming close on time here, I'm going to go ahead. I like to start to round things out. Is there something that you wanted me to bring up that I didn't? Because I like to follow what you're saying more than covering the book exhaustively. But is there anything in the book that you wished I had brought up?
The book finishes with examples about human cloning and genetically modified foods and torture. I can't remember what the fourth example is, but I guess the point I want to affirm is this is about very significant forms of Christian witness in the face of either very complex social movements like how we grow our food, or in the face of things like political persecution. This isn't an idle conversation about literary theory or theatrical rehearsing or those kind of things. This is really about the nitty-gritty of what it means to be a Christian facing the kind of challenges we're facing today. And though I originally wrote the book in 2004, and I probably did know who Donald Trump was in those days, but I certainly didn't know what artificial intelligence was, and climate change was nothing like as pressing an issue as it is today. There's not really much in the book that I would change if I was to go back to it today, because I think it does provide tools, and I use those tools every day. I guess to give one illustration of how I've used this in pastoral ministry was going back a few years now. We had a bit of a fight at my own church about the fact that the concert department would put on free lunchtime concerts 3 weekdays a week, and the clergy would have a communion service, choral communion service, 1 day a week, and there would be just the Thursdays were a bone of contention because not many people were coming to a spoken service, and the concert department rather fancied having another large service. And we used to get 350 people to come to these concerts on a regular basis. So after I've been here a year, I said, why don't we do this? Why don't we provide something that feels like a concert, but actually turns out to be a bit more like a worship service? So we created something called Great Sacred Music, which has been running over 10 years now and has been extremely popular, where we have a professional choir who sing 6 or 8 pieces of music. And then I narrate them to the congregation in terms of their theological and historical background and a bit of detail about the composer and 1 or 2 funny stories. In other words, I over-accepted it. I could have blocked the concert department by saying, we're just going to have worship even if no one comes. I could have accepted and just said, no, let's just have concerts 4 days a week. But I over-accepted and said, let's do something that feels like a concert, but is in fact a kind of worship. And it's been a blessing to me and to many people. And I keep meeting members of our congregation who said they started coming to St. Martin's because they first came to Great Sacred Music because it was a gentle form of introduction to church or reintroduction to church for people who've been away a long time. That's an example, just in terms of pastoral ministry, how the notion of over-accepting can be extremely powerful. And I wouldn't want people to think it was an idle thing that was just for specialists in Christian ethics. It's a day-to-day practice, and we constantly ask ourselves on our ministry team here at St. Martin's how we can over-accept situations that seem very challenging.
So other than obviously this book, which I highly recommend, I don't reread books very often, but now I've read this one at least twice. Are there other books in this space or any other space that you would recommend to people to get a better idea of what you're presenting
I
here?
did take away the idea of improvisation, and I wrote a commentary on the Book of Esther in the Brazos commentary series in, I can't remember which year, 2011, something like that, which was published alongside a commentary on Daniel. And I basically saw the Book of Esther as an over-accepting of the diaspora. That might be worth people reading if they want to see a sort of sustained scriptural engagement with improvisation. I guess, in a sense, that the major fruit of this work has come in 2 places. One, my book Nazareth Manifesto, published in 2015, which has been how I conceive of appropriate forms of Christian social engagement, particularly things like the Messiah complex in terms of trying to help people. Also, my book A Future Bigger Than the Past, which takes some of these improvisation ideas and applies them, just like I've described that Great Sacred Music story, that applies them to how the church engages secularism and how the church takes the opportunity of some of the challenges of today to become more faithful to what maybe it should have been all along. So I would say a Nazareth Manifesto and A Future That's Bigger Than the Past would be 2 ways to go to see how these ideas play out in practice.
Okay. What do you read for fun?
Oh, I'm a great reader of novels. I don't read that much non-fiction. In fact, I mostly read novels. And I've always got a few novels. I've just actually finished a book of William Boyd short stories. But I love reading great big fat novels. The Transylvanian trilogy about Hungary just before the First World War by Miklos Banfi is a big favourite and got me through lockdown, along with Elena Ferranti and Sigrid Undset's book, Kristin Lavransdatter. Those are all books of about 1,500 pages that I strongly recommend, and I got completely absorbed in for months at a time.
Wow. That's quite an endeavor. That's quite an undertaking. 1,500 pages.
Yeah, I think the only book of that length that I've read that I'm not sure I thought was the best was Lawrence Durrell's Alexandrian Quartet. I'm not sure it's of the same level as the other. Once you committed yourselves to a really big book, you really want to finish it. But that hasn't stayed with me in the same way as the other 3 very much have stayed with me.
Do you remember when you developed an affection for novels in particular?
I think I got it through my sister. I think my sister was a voracious reader growing up, and I tended to watch a lot of sport. But I saw how much she got from reading, so I initially read books that she recommended, and I still do often read books that my sister recommends or gets me for Christmas or something like that. But I do remember, because I'm not a particularly fast reader, but I do remember realizing that when we were given David Copperfield, which is a 900-page book to read when I was about 13 or something at high school, I remember my friends hadn't read it. And I had, because I actually enjoyed reading it. It wasn't just an assignment. I really enjoyed reading it. And so I think, reading has been, and I'm a preacher before I'm a theologian, really. And a lot of my sermons have extensive engagement with English literature. That's very much been the principal source of my imaginative world.
I think Dickens is probably the person I forget I enjoy more frequently than any other. For me, it was Great Expectations. When I first read that, this is so much fun. I wasn't into reading at the time. It took me a few years, but okay. I won't keep you. If you don't have anything else for us, I'll call this one good. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me.